Thank you guys for being here. This is awesome. It's a good turnout. My name is Phil Garrity. I am a first-year student at Boston College. Maybe we can... Thank you. So I'm a first-year student at Boston College School of Theology and Ministry. I'm studying theology, and I'm also interested in psychology, and especially as it pertains to caring for the sick. So I'll sort of, this will be very relevant to that. And you'll hear a little bit more about my background. But this presentation, it's called The Good Death, Insights on Global End-of-Life Care from the Catholic-Buddhist Dialogue. It's kind of an amalgamation of a lot of different interests of mine, and just sort of a disclaimer. I'm not really an expert on any of this. This is more things that really interest me and that I want to learn more about. So in many ways, this presentation is very rhetorical. It's just meant to sort of point towards some, what I feel are important issues currently, and especially sort of in development and in global health, and also in pastoral care and theological work as well. So a lot of this is just going to be me kind of riffing on what I've found to be interesting, lots of sort of excerpts from little things I've read. So hopefully I will not eat up all the time. I think they gave us a little bit more time. We got until 2:50, so we've got about 40 minutes. So hopefully I'll leave at least 10 minutes at the end, and I'd love to hear from people sort of what resonated and some thoughts from you guys. So, all right, so we'll get started. Okay, so I just wanted to start with a poem. We do this a lot in theology school. We like read poems and stuff. So this is a poem that I like especially. It says, to live, oh, it's an excerpt actually. To live in this world, you must be able to do three things. To love what is mortal, to hold it against your bones, knowing your life depends on it, and when the time comes to let it go, to let it go. It's by Mary Oliver. And also this is, I'll talk more about it, but this is actually where I was this summer in Ireland. It's a cool Buddhist retreat center, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later, but just to get us started with that. So you guys have probably heard in the news these past few weeks and months about Brittany Maynard. If not, she is a young woman who died a few weeks ago, and she sort of came to the national spotlight because she had a terminal cancer diagnosis that was gave her about 6 months to live, and that sort of deadline was around November 1st, which is when she actually voluntarily took her own life. And so it was this big debate around what's called death with dignity. There are a few states in the U.S., Oregon is one of them, where people can actually be prescribed lethal medications to end their lives in the event of, for instance, terminal diagnosis, or I'm not really sure what the criteria are, but I just wanted to kind of start with this. I'm not going to get into the politics of it. It's a really sort of contentious issue. I'm happy to sort of speak to my opinions about it, but we will kind of, I'll come back to this at the end, and I just kind of wanted to show it as a very relevant current example of sort of this issue of how do we think about dignified and peaceful death, and what is ethical, and what is our mandate as people who are privileged enough to have resources to keep people comfortable and either extend or terminate their lives, really sort of at the control of whoever, doctors or whoever else. But really, what do we need to take into account other than just the fact that the resources are available, or there is a pill, or there is an intervention we can use. So we'll come back to that, but I just wanted to kind of start with that. And then this is just a little kind of history recap. A lot of what I'll be drawing from is a book that came out last month by Atul Gawande. It's called Being Mortal, Medicine and What Matters in the End. It's a really great book, and it talks, he's a surgeon from the Brigham, which is a big hospital in Boston where I live. And he talks about sort of the state of end-of-life care in this country, and how we do a pretty not so great job at ensuring that people's wishes are respected, that they die comfortably, and basically we see so often people sort of being sent to an ICU, being intubated, having their ribs broken in resuscitation when they haven't asked for that, and the conversation itself hasn't even happen. So he's really sort of shifting the focus to say, look, we need to have a broader conversation about what people's real goals are beyond just extending their lives. So things like, being lucid, being with their families, being at home, being comfortable. These are all sort of priorities that need to be taken into account beyond just, once again, let's fix it with a medical intervention. So anyways, so this is just like a very high-level sort of background. Just to put in context the fact that for most of human civilization, average life expectancy has been between 20 and 30 years old. And that's mostly because of really, really high rates of infant death, neonatal mortality, as well as maternal mortality, and just the fact that modern medicine didn't really come into existence until the 18th and 19th century. So we can see this huge spike sort of in the last 200, 300 years, where we're actually dealing with people who have chronic illness, who have sort of conditions that can be managed over a much longer period of time, and which calls for sort of care that actually tends to their illness rather than just a catastrophic event that ends their life suddenly, which was more of the norm for the vast majority of human history. So the state of things now, at least in resource-richer settings, which is sort of another buzzword in development for developed countries or first-world countries, but some pitfalls I already sort of talked about is that, and Atul Gawande points this out, is our incredible reliance or over-reliance on life-extending and life-saving technologies at the end of life. And these account for, the economics of it aren't really as important to me personally, I don't think they are to him, but they account for a huge majority of our healthcare expenditure. In the last 6 months of life, I think it's something like 30 to 40% of our healthcare dollars are spent on intensive sort of interventions that occur in the last 6 months of people's lives, which makes sense, right? Because generally speaking, we're a fairly healthy country. We're unhealthy in a lot of ways, but it's really only at the end when we need something like a very intensive heart surgery or to remove cancer or to restore failing organs or whatnot. So this is he points to sort of the problems of this and really says that. This is a quote from him. He says, "For more than half a century now, we have treated the trials of sickness, aging, and mortality as medical concerns. It's been an experiment in social engineering, putting our fates in the hands of people valued more for their technical prowess than for their understanding of human needs." And he says here, that experiment has failed. If safety and protection were all we sought in life, perhaps we could conclude differently. But because we seek a life of worth and purpose, and yet are routinely denied the conditions that might make it possible, there is no other way to see what modern society has done. So that's a pretty kind of dark and gloomy picture of sort of modern medicine and sort of the biomedical model towards really seeing people as broken machines that need to be fixed and not really taking into account the fact that it's not always about fixing, and especially when it comes to end-of-life issues, that's ultimately the case, right? Because he's pointing towards this phenomenon that we medicalize dying as if it's something that we need to control to the final second, and it's something that often becomes a disservice to people, as once again they're not able to live out their last 6 weeks comfortably or with their families or conscious, and this isn't just sort of a small thing. This is the trend in this country. In fact, I think I have some statistics here. Yeah. 70% of people in the U.S. will ultimately have someone else making their final healthcare decisions. And about 1/3 of people have a formal conversation with either a health proxy or their doctor about their last wishes. So you can see there's a huge margin of people who have to have someone else make a decision for them, and they haven't talked about it. So Atul Gawande is great because he doesn't really, he's not talking rocket science. He points to fairly intuitive, simple ideas, and he says, the takeaway of this book is we need to have conversations. We need to institutionalize them and not just have palliative care, which is, we'll get a little bit more into the origins of that, be sort of something that someone gets referred to. But all people in helping professions and medical professions need to be versed in having these conversations with people about their real goals. So I was saying, you know, we see this huge sort of spike in life expectancy, but obviously there's some enormous disparities which need to be considered. So granted, yeah, if we look at sort of medieval times, we're doing a whole lot better globally. But there's still, you know, we can see in Africa, even in 2010, it's about a little more than half the life expectancy in developed areas like the United States, which is a problem. Sort of these disparities are really egregious and actually need to be taken into account. And I think I am and I was reluctant sort of talking about a lot of this because it seems kind of silly to be focusing on sort of the problems of the elite, right? Because we're talking about very, you know, expensive, highly sort of technical interventions that are really not available in a vast majority of the world. And it seems kind of pointless to be talking about that when there's so much need in the world that really this would be a luxury to be able to be intubated or to be able to have your kidneys running on dialysis. And yet, the bigger point of this talk is to really try to sort of reach around both sides of this, around sort of resource poor and resource rich settings, and point to an imbalance in both of them, and we'll get to that in a second. So I was just sort of points to another example, bigger pitfalls of healthcare and resource limited settings. So we talk about the quality of people's living and dying, and that's what this presentation is mostly about. And once again, we don't have a lot of words. There really isn't much to say when there simply is nothing available in terms of resources to tend to people as their bodies sort of break down. Or in the case of Ebola, when it's a catastrophic event where you're literally just quarantined the minute you have symptoms, and are probably, like in this case, this is a abandoned schoolroom where it's an isolation ward, and this person is being hosed down, probably by chlorine. And then we see in this next photo, this is another patient who's waiting, and this is the same room, and this is the same person who had just died. So obviously these conditions are really just unspeakable, and I could spend a whole lot more time, and I will sort of touch on it, just talking about the enormous imperative we have to get resources, just bare essentials, and we'll look at this next, like morphine, into countries to at least have some semblance of comfort and dignity for people in sort of their final days and weeks and months. And this, once again, I mean, infectious disease and something as virulent as Ebola, I'm not going to speak to how we would, you know, really manage in a technical sense or achieve a good death, but we can sort of imagine that we have a very long way to go. The fact that the conditions and the systems are such that people are dying like this just shows that a lot more attention and energy and resources need to be applied to most of the world. So, a big part of this, I'm going to be talking about, part of palliative care is pain management. It's about keeping people comfortable, and not necessarily with terminal illness, but also with traumatic injury or chronic illness. And a major part of that is access to opioids, which morphine would be the most common. And the reason why this might seem like a very sort of like, you know, technical, very small thing that I'm picking up on, but the reason why it's so important is because this is unlike disparities in medical resources and health resources, even sort of as they currently exist in global health. So opioids and basic pain relief medications there's a much bigger discrepancy in disparity and availability than even other drugs, where there's already abysmally low levels of those. And it's really for several reasons. So we don't see all the countries here, and this is kind of blurry, but this is the US over here, and then this is sort of the rest of the world. And basically this is opioid consumption. And so there's really about 120 countries virtually have no access to morphine. And morphine is a staple, it's an essential medicine listed by the World Health Organization for treating moderate to severe pain. So basically, a vast majority, I don't know if I have a statistic, it's probably something like 80 to 90% of people in sort of their final days, weeks, and months require morphine, a morphine equivalent or something stronger because of their pain. Whether that's because your organs are failing, you have end-stage renal disease, advanced AIDS, cancer, those are really the major killers in the world. You need morphine. It's not just like a, oh, maybe you do. It's actually a staple. And the fact that this isn't around leaves sort of communities relying on things like Tylenol, like giving Tylenol every 10 minutes to mitigate level 9 or 10 pain, which is really essentially useless. So a few sort of issues that make this availability so low. Eric Krakauer, who's a doctor in Boston, this has been his shtick for 30 years. He's been the morphine guy, and he works with Partners in Health, which I'm affiliated with, and he explains that some barriers to palliative care in low and middle income countries are misunderstandings of palliative care, lack of national palliative care policies, inaccessibility of opioids, which is probably the biggest one, and opiophobia, which is the unwarranted fear of opioid side effects, addiction, and diversion. So that's a huge issue in the US. We actually do have a very serious prescription pain medication abuse problem. But that sort of gets translated in an international context to such an extent that people are afraid of shipping the drugs into these countries, even prescribing them. That's often the biggest hurdle. Is once they're in the countries, doctors are afraid to prescribe them because they're not well educated on the side effects. It's actually very safe. It doesn't actually cause any organ damage like a lot of other harmful drugs can. It's incredibly cheap. It's very effective. Like I said, it's really the staple and it has been for a very long time. And yet, there's sort of this self-perpetuating cycle of low use and then low demand, which results in limited availability. So it's kind of, I'm not going to get into the economics probably because I don't know them that well, but that's sort of a general sort of idea of what the real problem is and why there's such a egregious absence of these drugs. So, like I said, I worked for Partners in Health for 3 years. And one country I wanted to highlight in particular, Rwanda, is one of the places that we work. And I was doing a little bit of research with this, and I was really astounded to find that Rwanda in 2011 became the first country in Africa to implement a national palliative care program. So that's in 2011. That was 3 years ago. It was like the first time that they had ever had any sort of form. I think in 2005 there was one NGO that did a training of 5 people. And this is like some nuns or something like talked about how to manage pain and tend to people and stuff like that. So it's like, it's really mind-boggling to think like, it's not just like, oh yeah, they're a little bit behind. It's like, this is like 2 years ago, 3 years ago, it's now coming on the scene. So, so I'm going to talk a little bit more about Rwanda, but a little bit about my story to connect to some of this. So a few years ago, I was diagnosed with bone cancer. And when I was working for Partners in Health, and I took a leave of absence. And what kind of jumped out in sort of shaping this presentation was thinking about how much morphine I took. So this is me at the end of treatment. Let's see. So I did chemotherapy and surgery for about 8 or 9 months, and I was trying to, this is a rough, I think fairly conservative estimate of how much morphine I used. So there were about 75 days that I needed morphine. It was about 35 milligrams of morphine equivalents per day on average. That was about 2,600 milligrams. So if we compare that to, and if drawing from the chart that we just saw, the per capita consumption in the US is around 500 milligrams. And that's, not everybody takes morphine every year, but that's generally how they measure it. It's just you take the total population, divide that by, actually the total consumption divided by the population. So that's around 500. So I used about 5 people's worth, or in the US, if we all divvied it up, I took about 5 people's worth annually. That's how much we have circulating in the country. If we compare that to Rwanda, which is 0.0728 milligrams per person in Rwanda, I used about 35,000 people's share of morphine, and that was just during my less than a year of treatment. So I thought that was like a really staggering thing to kind of put into perspective. The fact just that sort of slice of the pie that I consumed. Needless to say that sort of just the dollar amount it was over $850,000 that went into my treatment, which is about as much as we spend on our cancer program in Rwanda, which is amazing that we have one, and it really is kind of a revolutionary program, which is just emerging. But just to say, we treat thousands of patients a year for a fraction of that amount. So it's just, to quote Paul Farmer, I don't know if he says this exactly, but there's a lot of elasticity with prices and the real sort of cost of actually treating someone. So a lot of that, there's a lot of inflation sort of factored into our system. So the wholesale cost of my treatment was not that much. But obviously there's markups and there's insurance and whatnot. So yeah, it's just something to kind of hopefully a cool juxtaposition. So basically this is sort of what I was getting at earlier. Oops. So this is the imbalance, is that in resource-richer settings, we see that we've got material needs taken care of, for the most part. I mean, and once again, there's huge discrepancies in the US. But generally speaking, there are plenty of places where we have really every technology and pill and sort of intervention that we could want, and yet non-material needs, which we could say are emotional, mental, spiritual, we don't do such a great job at those. And I pointed to some examples of where we fall short and really sort of treating the person as a person and not just a broken machine. And then in resource-limited settings, we really, material resources are so woefully absent. And then non-material needs, I didn't mean to say that they do a great job of that there, but that's really all that, when you don't have an intervention, when you don't have a medication, and it is often, you're not even in a hospital, you're just sort of at home, you're being tended to by your family. And so in that sense, I think we do have a lot to learn from places that are more materially impoverished. Not to romanticize or glorify poverty or illness by any means, but just to say that I think there is part of this sort of problem and solution that both sort of areas in the world can really provide us with. So this is, once again, like the least profound thing I'll say, like, is this is what we need to think more about, is having a balance between material and non-material needs, okay? And once again, we see huge extremes in the settings that we've talked about, and we need to achieve a finer balance. So, so the real goals of medicine. I really like this. Eric Krakauer sort of referenced this guy, Eric Castle, who wrote a book called The Nature of Suffering and the Goals of Medicine. And he says, medicine's most fundamental goal is not to try to cure disease, replace failing organs, or manipulate molecules, but to relieve the suffering of patients. These other ends should be in the service of relieving suffering. So once again, it seems really like obvious, but it's actually a huge paradigm shift in medicine as we know it. Because to say that it's not just about fixing, about curing that disease, that is kind of the MO, that's the status quo. So to really sort of shift towards how do we take care of this person, and even if their goal is to die comfortably and to stop, to not do that 5th level chemo or surgery, which might not make sense from a medical perspective because it has a chance of working, or there's only minimal side effects or whatever. But actually sort of respecting that person's vision beyond, once again, just extending their lives, but recognizing they have other priorities. And then this is a quote from Atul Gawande: "The goal is not a good death. The goal is as good a life as possible until the end." So I just thought that was cool because I found that after I sort of titled this presentation, I was like, okay, well, I guess Atul doesn't agree with me, but he's right. I mean, once again, he's careful not to glorify death, like, oh, it's this wonderful thing. And much of what I'll say in the rest of this presentation, which will get much more into the spiritual stuff, might sound like that. It might sound like morbid fascination, or that we're sort of like romanticizing death, and it's a very slippery slope. And so I just hope that we have kind of like an open mind with it, because I think it's very good to think about these things and to consider that different wisdom traditions shed a lot of light on what it means to face mortality, and that it doesn't need to be this dreary, despairing thing, but it can actually be incredibly life-affirming. So we'll get into that, but I guess I'll kind of skip this. This is just a quote from a Buddhist monk who was actually a French scientist before he went to Nepal, and he's been there for 30 years. But he basically just says that, he says, science therefore can improve the conditions we live in. If we feel cold, it can provide us warmth. If we fall ill, it can cure us. And from that viewpoint, all on its own, the ideal would be to live for hundreds of years in perfect health. But whether we live for 30 or 100 years, the question of the quality of life remains the same. The only way to live with true quality is to give it an inner meaning. Okay? So this is sort of the idea, once again, kind of breaking the paradigm a little bit, or stretching it to say that maybe it's not just about keeping myself as healthy as possible and living as long as I can. Okay? This is kind of speaking to that. This is an interesting graph that I found. This is the average income, average income in the U.S. from 1955 to 2005 is steadily increasing, and this is in $1995, so it's not just that we were earning less back then. But you can see that the proportion of very happy people has stayed relatively constant, even as we've seen this huge increase in relative income. Once again, here's like an opportunity to be like, wait a minute, are we trying to say like resources don't actually improve our lives and don't actually make things better? Yes, they do. And I was kind of looking for some other graphs that show like it sucks to be making like $15,000 a year. Like depression and stress and anxiety and addiction, you're way more predisposed towards that. But once we reach a certain level, I think I've read somewhere around $75,000 a year, we're really no more happy once we sort of get more money beyond that point. So once we have our basic needs met, and maybe more than just our basic needs, but social, cultural, and intellectual and whatnot, there's really kind of a plateauing effect of material, sort of the benefits of material goods. So I think this is an important idea because it sort of speaks to a larger tendency that just as humans, which is our sort of constant striving for more and to keep ourselves comfortable and secure and safe. And it's very natural, but it gets us into some trouble when we kind of play out those ways of being and living and take them to extremes where we end up, I think, producing a lot of anguish for ourselves. So this is some little tidbit of wisdom from Buddhism. And I thought this was really cool because when I first read about this a few years ago, I was like, man, this explains my life so much. So these are the 8 worldly concerns, or dharmas. And this is from Kama Children's book, When Things Fall Apart. So basically, there are these 4 things that we all seek, we all try to get more of. We all sort of, and naturally so. It's not bad, it's not right, it's wrong. It's just what we do. We want pleasure, we want gain, we want praise, we want fame, right? And there are opposites, which we don't want. We don't want pain, we don't want loss, we don't want blame, we don't want disgrace, right? And so what Buddhism says, or the Buddha said, is that we spend so much of our lives trying to avoid pain and gain pleasure, trying to avoid loss and gain things or keep them, right? Trying to keep from losing things. We try to, people please and like sort of, be a good person and improve our self-image, and we don't want to be blamed for things we do wrong. And we also want to be well known. We don't want to, anonymity is really scary, to just disappear and be like nothing's no one, right? So once again, these are really natural things to want, to not want, and to want. But what Buddhism says is that in our constant striving and sort of running between these 2 poles, that's what produces suffering. An interesting thing in Buddhism, suffering doesn't so much refer to pain, it refers to mental anguish. That's a better translation for it. It's mental anguish. And so I thought this was so profound when I first saw it, because it really does kind of capture so much. I've been the people pleaser, worried about my image. I've been terrified of losing people, even friendships, or just people like in a mortal sense. I hate pain. I want to be comfortable, right? So, and all of that, just that frantic desire to hold on to those things, and what Buddhism will say is a form of grasping. It's grasping after these things, and this aversion, or they call it attachment to these positive worldly concerns, and aversion from the negative ones. So this attachment and aversion is a big part of their understanding of human psychology. So, this leads us to recognizing two important things that Buddhism really points to. And this is really the meat and potatoes of like what they feel we need to come to terms with and understand and integrate into our lives. As scary as it is initially, it actually becomes once again an incredibly life-affirming thing to really recognize impermanence and interdependence. So, and here's a quote here from Metz, who, if you've been to the STM, you know Metz, probably a lot of other theology schools, but I love this quote. "We are all beggars. We are all members of a species that is not sufficient unto itself. We are all creatures plagued by unending doubts and restless, unsatisfied hearts. Our needs are always beyond our capacities, and we only find ourselves when we lose ourselves." So, we need to kind of speed up. So basically, impermanence, just to give you a sense, it's really this, it's the fact that everything changes, right? And we were kind of talking about diminishing returns of satisfaction. The fact that even there's over a dozen studies that show that lottery winners are no happier than people who don't win the lottery. At least like 6 months out, their levels of satisfaction drop back to normal. And in fact, they're more predisposed towards bankruptcy and depression and addiction because of this sort of surge and well, I don't know why, but it's to show that that we have fleeting satisfaction and there's this perpetual trend of normalizing, and it's wired into our brains too. That's how our dopamine circuits work. And also, it's so much of that mental anguish once again is trying to see things as permanent. Like I'm always going to have this. I'm always going to have this thing or this person or whatever. And the fact that it's going to disappear, it's going to change or evolve, anguishes us, right? So that's kind of how impermanence and not understanding that in a realistic way leads to suffering. Interdependence just really means how utterly connected we are to everything and to everyone. And I heard this thing one time: if you don't understand interdependence, try holding your breath for an hour, then you'll understand it. So just this sense that we are, like even in an atomic sense, we are connected to the universe and to everyone else. A couple of cool fun facts that I found when I was doing this. Within 1 year, so every year of our lives, all of the atoms of our body are replaced by atoms that were not in our body before that. All of them. So literally, in a very physical sense, we can say that we die every single year. Our physical selves completely get replaced out. And in Buddhism, they would sort of point to, okay, well then where is the self? Right? Where is your body? Like if you are not all these atoms right now, because they'll literally be gone in less than a year, well then are you now in the trees and the air? And what stays sort of, where's the continuity? And we'll get to a quote in this next slide. And then this other thing, I had heard this one time and I looked it up. In every single breath you take, there are, they've done, like scientists have done like the statistics on this. There are at least, even if we say, let's presume that we're going to take one figure from history, Jesus. We're going to say that 99.999% of the air that he breathed during his 33 years on Earth is somehow locked away, or it's just like gone. Even so, and that's like an incredibly conservative estimate, every single breath that you take, there are 4 air molecules that were in his lungs. That it's like statistically impossible that they were not, that are breathed with every breath that you have. And without that, if we just say that his air that he breathed and passed through his lungs is floating around in the universe, there are trillions of air molecules, every breath that you take, that touched his, literally. This is not like it doesn't say anything about like spirituality or whatever. It's just a physical, that's how atoms sort of interchange with each other and how interconnected we are. And so it's a really kind of cool way to think about interdependence. So this is a retreat I went on in Ireland. I mentioned the place I went to there. And this is a Buddhist monk, Sogyal Rinpoche, who wrote this great book, The Tibetan Book of Living and Dying. And he says, if everything dies and changes, then what is really true? Is there something behind the appearances, something boundless and infinitely spacious, something in which the dance of change and impermanence takes place? Is there something, in fact, we can depend on that does survive what we call death? Okay, so this is once again, I think we reach sort of a precipice here. We need to take a leap of faith to assume, okay, is there anything that lasts? Because we can quickly slip into nihilism here if we just think, well, everything changes and nothing's permanent, whatever. And that's how a lot of people see Buddhism, is it's just like, well, nothing really exists and nothing matters and whatever. But they say, no, that's absolutely not it. There's incredible value in human life. And recognizing, once again, coming to terms with our limited nature, the fact that we will get sick and we will die, and we have limitations in just being human. That makes life all the more precious and all the more urgent for us to make use of. So, this is from St. Ignatius. We should not fix our desires on health or sickness, wealth or poverty, success or failure, a long life or a short one. So what this is getting at is what in Jesuits will call indifference, okay, which is kind of a loaded term. It can be really sort of misunderstood. But another form, a biblical term, disinterested love, the fact that we can love someone or something selflessly. We don't have a personal agenda, and we are just open to sort of living in a way where we're not so concerned about what we get back, what we get from it, right? So, and that can be seen as detachment. Buddhism, once again, a really loaded term that can be misunderstood, because it's not about detaching and like not caring about things and just being emotionless and cold. It's about having a bit of sort of a relationship to things where we're not clinging on to them with our own agendas about what it needs to look like and who we feel we need to be, but we're actually open to embracing life as it is and embracing ourselves for who we are. Okay, so detachment, which is, I think I like it better termed as non-possessiveness. So not being possessive towards anything, ourselves, our bodies, our lives, in this sense of, well, it's mine and I'm entitled to it and I'm taking it for granted. It's just a given and it will always be here, but it's actually, no, it's a gift, right? And at least in lots of traditions, it will see it that way. And then this term equanimity, which really, once again, just means this balance, where we are able to be open to life as it is and not necessarily be so sort of have these personal biases that sort of get in the way. So I really got to speed up. The cost of following love. So I have like a ton of little like scriptural things here, which I won't go through all of them, but it sort of gets this idea. There's this idea of giving up the self in Scripture, in the Gospels in particular, and it's this scary idea of like giving up, like just Jesus often says, like, leave everything you have and follow me. And we can imagine, we sort of put ourselves in the shoes of the disciples. It's like, what? Like, he says, like, leave your mom and dad, just let's go. And in this, he says, take nothing for the journey. He told them, neither stick nor pack, neither bread nor money. Okay? So once again, the instructions Jesus gives to his disciples as they leave to preach the good news portray a particular attitude and lifestyle. The attitude is that of complete dependence on God. Their lives must manifest complete detachment from the success or failure of their mission. Okay, which once again, the dharmas, right? Like, I gotta achieve, I gotta win, I gotta succeed, and it's to say, like, let go of the results and what comes of this, but live authentically. That's kind of what this is getting at. So not just possessions, but family too. I won't read through all this, but or the shorter one says, if anyone comes to me and does not hate his own father and mother and wife and children and brothers and sisters, yes, even his own life, he cannot be my disciple. That sounds like really, whoa, like Jesus, what are you talking about? This is also translated as, whoever loves these other things more than me is not worthy to be with me. Okay? And I think, at least the way that I've come to understand it, is it's not about Jesus being like territorial, being like, hey, don't like him, like me, like it's going to hurt my feelings. He's really indicating how we need to live, which is like, you need to let go of your mom and dad and your body and everything. That's how we live and ultimately die. And there's a grace in that. And there's something that if we can do that, if we can learn to like let life go, hold on to it, like the poem said in the beginning, hold on to it, but also let it go, right? Let it kind of flow through our fingers. There's a really sort of graceful way of living and doing that. So, and then ultimately, even one's very self, whoever tries to keep their life will lose it, whoever loses their life will preserve it. This is another one, unless a kernel of wheat falls to the ground and dies, it remains whole and seed, blah, blah, blah. This quote from C.S. Lewis, give up yourself and you will find your real self. Lose your life and you will save it. Submit to death Death of your ambitions and favorite wishes every day, and death of your whole body in the end. Submit with every fiber of your being, and you will find eternal life. A cool thing that I read from this Father Lawrence Freeman, who did a dialogue with the Dalai Lama, he said, eternal life does not simply mean an unending existence. It means the full development of the human potential for consciousness. Full consciousness is therefore the fulfillment of the human capacity to love, to learn to love as God loves, unconditionally and universally. That's what this means, is being able to open ourselves to a radical degree where we can actually, once again, be sort of conduits of love, where it's not in this sort of a partial kind of agenda-seeking way. I'm not going to go through this. This is something that I sort of was helpful for me when I was doing, just before I started treatment, but it's about opening ourselves to uncertainty in life. Now it's on the timer. Anyways, and this is a Buddhist meditation center in Cambridge where I'm part of. All right, I'm going to have to decide like 2 slides I'm going to finish with, so I'm totally out of time. Okay, this is just a cool thing that like medieval Christian monks, they used to whisper to each other memento mori, like in the cloisters and stuff, which means remember death. And that was a way of just sort of keeping their focus on, look, life is limited. And by meditating on this, there's actually incredible value in that. So learning to grow old, here's another sort of story of Jesus where he says, when you are old, you will stretch out your hands and someone else will dress you and lead you where you do not want to go. Once again, it seems very scary and like, oh, that's terrible. But I think he's pointing more towards, once again, not feeling ourselves to be so sort of self-sufficient, but we actually have this dependence on others and on the universe, and that can actually be incredibly empowering too. Blah, blah, blah. This is another quote, love is non-grasping. That's something I learned from a teacher at the center that I go to, which that's not an adjective. It doesn't mean non-grasping love. Love is the act of, or the noun of non-grasping. Okay, and then that was a bumper sticker that I found when I was doing treatment. Okay, I'm going to end with this. Okay, so this woman, her name is Kara Tippett, and she responded to Brittany Maynard, saying she has terminal cancer, she has a few kids, and she responded to Brittany just writing a letter saying a few things. I too am dying, your life matters, your story matters, your suffering matters. Yes, your dying will be hard, but it will not be without beauty. I love you, and I'm sorry you are dying. I'm sorry that we are both being asked to walk a road that feels simply impossible to walk. This was a few weeks ago, actually, a few months ago, or a month ago. But she was just urging her not to take that pill. Ultimately, she did. And once again, I actually, politically, I'm more like okay with, I'm not trying to like, I just thought it was a cool, different perspective where this woman who is in a very similar situation is trying to sort of make common cause with somebody else who's facing a very despairing situation. This was a picture she left Brittany with, which I really love just because it's like her kind of being swallowed up by her family. So that is my presentation. Yeah. It's literally 2:50 right now, so if we want to ask a few questions until they kick us out, that's fine, or I'll just stay around. Are there any kind of burning comments, questions? Yeah?
I currently work here in DC with an organization that provides unavoidable care for homeless individuals. And I find it very interesting, our staff is mostly Catholics and Buddhists. Like that is the religious relations of them.
Yeah.
This is more of a conversation, but I think, and you like touched on it here, it's just with the Ebola crisis too, we're forgetting about the people as people. And it's incredibly hard to think about these people dying without human touch, completely alone in a room, and treated as some disease, treated as the disease instead of a person themselves. And so I think you did a great job, though, in discussing the physical accommodations and also the spirituality.
Thank you.
No
Thank you. Yeah, and a bunch of books that I would highly recommend. This is like Christian-Buddhist dialogue, actually, which is a huge kind of intersection of Eastern and Western wisdom traditions, and of life care from the Buddhist and sort of Western perspective. So thank you guys for coming. I really appreciate it. This was awesome.